The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand.
He parted the Red Sea on screen and claimed to speak for God. But behind the cameras of Hollywood's greatest biblical epic, Charlton Heston was doing something very different from playing a holy prophet. He was building a reputation as one of the most difficult, arrogant, and ruthless men in the business. Co-stars dreaded working with him. Directors clashed with him openly. His own politics flipped completely and cost lives in the debate. And when a filmmaker finally cornered him with the truth, what came out was deeply uncomfortable. This is the full story of Charlton Heston and what really happened on and off the set of the Ten Commandments. The man who was not DeMille's first choice. To understand what happened on the set of the Ten Commandments, you first have to understand who Charlton Heston was before he ever put on Moses' robes. Because the story of how he got the role tells you almost everything about how he would behave once he had it. Cecil B. DeMille, the legendary director who had been making Hollywood epics since the silent film era, was not sitting around dreaming of Charlton Heston when he started planning his 1956 remake of the Ten Commandments. According to DeMille's own diary, his first instinct was William Boyd, the actor famous for playing Hopalong Cassidy in Western serials. That's right. DeMille's first choice for the role of the great Hebrew prophet Moses, one of the most iconic figures in all of religious history, was a cowboy actor from Saturday matinee pictures. When Boyd didn't work out, DeMille started doing screen tests. When he tested Heston, he wrote something revealing in his notes. He said Heston had a sinister quality and added bluntly, "You believe him, but he's not attractive." That is not exactly a glowing endorsement. That is a director talking himself into a casting decision. And yet, Heston did get the part. And once he did, everything changed. The film was an absolute monster of a production. It was shot partly on location in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and partly on massive sets built at Paramount Studios in Hollywood. It cost $13,272,381.87 to make, an almost unimaginable sum in the mid-1950s, and eventually grossed $90,066,230 by 1979. At least 14,000 extras and 15,000 animals were used in the production. It was, in every measurable sense, the biggest movie that had ever been attempted up to that point. DeMille knew this would be his last film. He was in his mid-70s, his health was fading, and he poured everything he had into it. Into this production walked Charlton Heston, who very quickly started acting like he was the one running the show. Heston had already established himself as a rising star. He had appeared in DeMille's earlier epic The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952, which won Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and he had been busy working in Hollywood films and television throughout the early 1950s. He had the physical build that made him ideal for epic roles. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that genuinely looked like it had been carved out of something solid. DeMille himself noticed that Heston bore an unusual resemblance to Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses. That resemblance was part of what sealed the deal. But physical likeness is one thing. The way a person carries himself on a set involving hundreds of crew members, dozens of cast members, and a legendary director is another thing entirely. By all accounts, Heston arrived on the Ten Commandments set with an ego already inflated. He had a habit, one that would follow him throughout his entire career, of taking himself very, very seriously. He didn't just play Moses. He appears to have believed on some level that he was Moses. According to Mark Elliott's biography, Charlton Heston, Hollywood's last icon, Heston had a strong ethical orientation and a tendency towards hubris that ultimately became both his greatest strength and his most damaging flaw. That hubris was on full display from the start. There were casting decisions made around the production that immediately created tension. In April 1955, a columnist noted that Anne Baxter and Charlton Heston got top billing over some other very important stars, Yvonne De Carlo and Edward G. Robinson, for instance. So far, the others aren't squawking. That "so far" is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the squawking did eventually come, just not all at once and not all in public. What is fascinating about the billing situation is who got quietly pushed to the side. Edward G. Robinson, who played the villain Dathan in the film, was a genuine Hollywood legend. He had been a massive star in the 1930s and 1940s. Robinson had been dropping in star status since the late 1940s and was now doing mostly B films. DeMille, whose right-wing politics Robinson despised, gave him this part, and Robinson's career got a big shot in the arm. Robinson was grateful and gave DeMille full credit in his unfinished memoirs. But the dynamic on set between Heston and Robinson was complicated and loaded with tension. Most of the last half of the Ten Commandments is essentially a running, verbal battle between Heston and Robinson. On screen, that worked. Behind the camera, having two actors with very different political views, Robinson was a liberal who despised right-wing politics, and Heston was moving toward conservatism. Sharing a set for months was not always comfortable. DeMille himself was suffering. During production, he had already experienced a serious heart attack while climbing a very tall ladder to observe a difficult shot. His assistant helped him down, and DeMille never admitted publicly how serious the episode was. He died less than 3 years after the film was completed. The man was literally giving his life for this production. And in that context, Heston's self-importance, his tendency to treat every decision on set as something that required his personal input and approval, was not always welcome. The film was shot between October 1954 and August 1955, a production period of almost a full year. That is an enormous amount of time for an actor and a cast to be living inside a production together. And during that time, patterns of behavior became visible that would follow Heston for the rest of his career. The co-stars who couldn't stand him. There's a particular quote about Charlton Heston that has become something of a legend in Hollywood circles. It came from Rex Harrison, the British actor who starred opposite Heston in The Agony and the Ecstasy in 1965, where Harrison played Pope Julius II and Heston played Michelangelo. After months of working together, Harrison gave a verdict on his co-star that was precise, devastating, and impossible to argue with. Harrison said, "Charlton Heston is good at playing arrogance and ambition, but in the same way that a dwarf is good at being short." Read that again. Harrison was not saying Heston was a bad actor. He was saying that what Heston performed on screen was not acting at all. It was simply Heston being Heston. The arrogance wasn't a character choice, it was his natural state. That quote, delivered with the kind of surgical precision only a truly furious person can manage, tells you more about Heston's reputation among his peers than almost anything else. But Harrison was not the only one. Not even close. When the Ten Commandments was finished and Heston moved on to other projects, he carried his behavior with him. One of the most documented and genuinely ugly situations involved his 1961 film El Cid, which he made alongside Sophia Loren, one of the most celebrated actresses in the world. Their relationship on set became a case study in professional dysfunction. According to the Heston biographer Mark Elliott in his book Hollywood's Last Icon, Loren got the actor really angry. He particularly hated having to perform love scenes with her, which made him most uncomfortable, even in the movie's climactic deathbed scene, where Heston could barely look at his wife. Think about that for a moment. In the deathbed scene, arguably the most emotionally demanding scene in the entire film, Heston was so personally hostile toward his co-star that he could not even look her in the eye while the cameras were rolling. He later claimed he was looking into the future, rather than into the eyes of his lover. That is a justification that does not hold up to any serious examination. Directors expect their actors to look at each other. Audiences notice when they don't. Heston's discomfort with Lauren and his refusal to work through it professionally hurt the film. Eventually, it is alleged that Heston grew so annoyed that he asked for a body double to take his position any time there was a shot with only Lauren in it. He also reportedly stopped looking at his co-star entirely at one point. The reasons for Heston's attitude toward Lauren have been debated. Some have suggested jealousy. Lauren was receiving enormous attention and praise on set, and had already won an Academy Award by this point, while Heston, despite his Moses role, was still not considered by many critics to be a truly great actor. Others have suggested simple personal incompatibility. Whatever the reason, the behavior was documented and real, and it made for a deeply unpleasant working environment for everyone involved in that production. Then there was the situation with William Wyler and The Big Country, the 1958 Western that featured both Heston and Gregory Peck. Director William Wyler was known for shooting an excessive number of takes on his films, usually without explaining to the actors what to do differently except to make it better. And this film was no exception. Many of the actors, including Gene Simmons and Carol Baker, were so traumatized by his directing style that they refused to speak about the experience for years. Heston, who had a supporting role in the film, a genuinely unusual situation for a man who considered himself the biggest star in the room at all times, reportedly clashed with the film's approach, and the fact that Peck, as the lead and as a co-producer on the film, had real power over decisions. Heston had actually considered turning down the role because his part was secondary. This is a revealing detail. Heston's instinct was not to look at a project and ask whether it was good. His instinct was to check where his name would appear in the credits and whether he would be the most important person on the call sheet. That's not artistic judgment. That's ego operating as a career strategy. And while the on-screen fistfight between Heston and Peck in The Big Country has been described as one of the great physical confrontations in Western film history, the off-screen tensions were real. Gregory Peck and Wyler, who were close friends, fought constantly on the set and had a falling out for 3 years. The atmosphere was tense enough that it leaked into everything. Heston's pattern was consistent across his career. He arrived expecting to dominate, he resented anyone he perceived as competition, and he responded to discomfort. Not by adjusting his behavior, but by doubling down on his own position. He was not someone who apologized or backed down. He was someone who made the people around him feel smaller so that he could feel larger, the voice of God. One of the most quietly extraordinary facts about the Ten Commandments is something most people who have seen the film multiple times don't even realize. When Moses encounters the burning bush and hears the voice of God, the voice the audience is hearing is actually Charlton Heston's own voice, processed and slightly deepened. For the voice of God in the burning bush, DeMille turned to an ancient Jewish legend in the Midrash Rabbah, which said that God spoke to Moses with the voice of Amram, Moses' father, so he would not be frightened. Charlton Heston's voice was slightly slowed and deepened, so, to summarize, Charlton Heston played Moses, and Charlton Heston was also the voice of God speaking to Moses. He was, in a very literal, technical sense, on both sides of the conversation between a prophet and the divine. It would be unfair to blame him for that. It was DeMille's decision, not his, but it became a symbol of how Heston moved through the world. His ego reached new heights when he released his reading of the Holy Bible on tape, because the implication was clear. Heston's was the voice of God. This was a man who had genuinely started to believe his own publicity. And in Hollywood, that is when things start to go wrong. The production of The Ten Commandments required Heston to spend months on grueling location shoots in Egypt, under intense heat, filming scenes that required extraordinary physical effort. He endured real hardship for the role. That part of his story deserves acknowledgement. The heat in the Egyptian desert during filming was punishing. The logistics of directing 14,000 extras across the landscape of the Sinai required military-level coordination. DeMille himself, already in poor health, was managing a production of almost impossible scale. Anyone who helped bring that film together was part of something genuinely historic. But the hardship of the shoot does not explain the behavior that surrounded it. Heston used the difficulty of the production and his central role in it as further evidence that he was exceptional, that the normal rules did not apply to him, that deference was something he was owed rather than something he should extend. His own son, Fraser Heston, who was famously cast as the infant Moses in the film, DeMille had promised his parents that if they had a boy, the baby would play the role, has spoken warmly about his father over the years. Fraser Heston has pointed out that his father did a lot of things that went against type that he's not as well known for, including leading the arts contingent of the Civil Rights March on Washington for Dr. Martin Luther King and serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild for 9 or 10 years. Those contributions were real. Heston's record on civil rights in the early 1960s was genuinely impressive. He marched. He picketed segregated restaurants and movie theaters. He was at the forefront of the controversy. He was a leader in Hollywood, picketing restaurants and leading the actors component of the 1963 March on Washington. But here's where the story of Charlton Heston becomes genuinely painful to trace. Because the same man who marched with Martin Luther King would later give speeches that got praised by white supremacists. The same man who called for gun control after the assassination of Robert Kennedy would later wave a rifle above his head and say the government would have to pry it from his cold, dead hands. The same man who demanded equal rights for Black Americans would, decades later, stand in front of conservative audiences and talk about cultural warfare in language that people like Julian Bond of the NAACP called bigoted and homophobic. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, across decades, and it was driven, at least in part, by that same quality that made him difficult on film sets, the absolute certainty that he was right, that his judgment was sound, and that anyone who disagreed simply didn't understand things as well as he did. The political flip. In 1968, Charlton Heston did something that takes real courage. After the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy by a gunman, Heston championed the Gun Control Act of 1968, a landmark federal law regulating firearms. He stood up publicly and said that guns needed to be better regulated. He used his fame and his enormous voice to push for something that a lot of powerful people in America didn't want. That was Charlton Heston in 1968. By 1997, that Charlton Heston was almost unrecognizable. After the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968, Heston had called for tougher gun control laws. But by the mid-1990s, he had shifted entirely, campaigning for conservative Republican candidates and forming his own political action committee. The shift is documented in detail. Heston had even had moderate instincts about gun rights until recently, and as recently as 1997 had declared that AK-47s are inappropriate for private use. And yet, 1 year later, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association and became the most famous face of the gun rights movement in America. Heston's softness on gun rights was actually an issue in his NRA election, but he quieted critics by backing off his earlier statements and hewing to the NRA's official line. He recently said that a Washington state initiative to require trigger locks was written by Satan. Let that sink in. A man who publicly said assault rifles had no place in private hands in 1997 was calling trigger lock requirements the work of Satan in 1998. Not because the facts changed, not because gun violence had decreased and the argument against regulation no longer held, but because he had aligned himself with an organization that required him to take a harder line, and he was willing to take it. In 2000, Heston stood before the cheering delegates gathered at the annual meeting of the National Rifle Association and pledged himself to a new crusade. As president of the NRA from 1998 to 2003, he inspired gun rights activists with his grand and unflinching opposition to government encroachments on his Second Amendment rights. The most famous moment came at the 2000 NRA convention, where he lifted a musket above his head and delivered the line that became the defining image of American gun culture: that the government would have to pry his gun from his cold, dead hands. As he had once lifted Moses' staff in the Ten Commandments, Heston held a musket above his head and dared Al Gore from afar to pry it from his cold, dead hands. The parallel was deliberate, and it was theatrical. Heston understood better than almost anyone the power of imagery. He had spent his career wielding props as symbols: the Moses staff parting the Red Sea, now a musket raised against government overreach. It was the same gesture, the same man, but in service of something very different. The speeches Heston gave during this period went well beyond Second Amendment advocacy. In a 1997 speech before the Free Congress Foundation, Heston offered one of his most elaborate analyses of what he called the contemporary crisis facing traditional values, declaring, "I find my blood pressure rising when Clinton's cultural shock troops participate in homosexual rights fundraisers but boycott gun rights fundraisers." He went after feminists, gay rights advocates, and what he called the Homosexual Coalition. Heston's speech is still featured on the website of white supremacist David Duke, who praised the remarks. Julian Bond, then board chairman of the NAACP, reacted by saying that Heston's civil rights credentials were seriously sullied by his bigoted and homophobic remarks and his attacks on racial minorities. The endorsement by white supremacist David Duke further threatens to erode the considerable respect many Americans felt toward Heston. This was the man who had marched with Martin Luther King. This was the man whose son had described him as a genuine champion of civil rights. And now his speeches were being reprinted and celebrated by white supremacists. There is a way to understand this trajectory that is almost sympathetic. To some observers, Charlton Heston became a kind of tragic figure. He had amazing strengths, did an immense amount of good for many people, but ultimately had hubris. The strong ethical orientation that allowed him to help so many people also seemed to lead him to pompously and excessively defend principles that failed to catch ethical nuances and demands. That framing, the tragic hero brought down by his own stubborn certainty, has appeal. But it lets Heston off too easily, because the choices he made in the 1990s and 2000s were not the result of confusion, illness, or being manipulated by people around him. They were the logical extension of a personality that had always believed it was right, that had always prioritized its own authority over the concerns of the people it affected, and that had never been forced to genuinely reckon with the consequences of its behavior. The Michael Moore confrontation. In 2002, filmmaker Michael Moore released Bowling for Columbine, a documentary about gun violence in America that won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. The film ends with a scene that became genuinely famous and genuinely controversial, in which Moore visits Charlton Heston at his home in Beverly Hills and confronts him about his role as NRA president in the aftermath of the 1999 Columbine High School massacre, where 13 people were killed by 2 student gunmen. Moore bought a map to the stars' homes, found where Heston lived, rang the bell on his gate, and was invited back for an interview. What followed was an uncomfortable exchange in which Heston struggled to explain and justify the NRA's position and his own presence at a rally in Denver shortly after the Columbine shooting. When Moore showed him a photo of a young girl who had been killed in a different shooting, a 6-year-old killed by a classmate in Flint, Michigan, and asked him to look at it, Heston was very gracious, politely excused himself from the interview, and walked away. Moore later left the picture outside his home. The scene is hard to watch for several reasons. The first is obvious. A man who helped shape American gun policy is being asked to look at a photograph of one of that policy's youngest victims, and he cannot do it. The second reason is more complicated. Heston had already announced he was suffering from symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. Moore himself later acknowledged the discomfort of that moment. In 2019, Moore told Vanity Fair, "I'm uncomfortable watching the scene now, and I'm uncomfortable sitting there with him. But I wasn't going to not put it in the film either." He revealed his core beliefs, but I remember feeling kind of sad about it later. Here's a man who 40 years before that marched with Martin Luther King, and now in his elderly years had just turned into this angry white guy. The scene was criticized by some as an unfair ambush of a sick man. It was defended by others as holding a powerful public figure accountable for public decisions. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and where you land on it depends heavily on what you think of the NRA's role in American gun violence, and whether celebrity status confers any lasting responsibility for the positions you publicly championed. What is not debatable is the arc of Charlton Heston's life and what it reveals. Here was a man who came from nothing in rural Illinois, born John Charles Carter in a town called No Man's Land, who built himself into one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. He appeared in 100 films over the course of 60 years. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Ben-Hur in 1959. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2003. He marched for civil rights at a time when that was genuinely dangerous for a Hollywood career. These are real achievements that deserve to sit alongside the complicated parts of his story. But the complicated parts are real too. The behavior on set, the ego, the clashes, the inability to share space generously with co-stars was not a minor footnote. It affected the people who worked with him. Gene Simmons, Carol Baker, and Sophia Loren all had difficult experiences in productions involving Heston. Many actors on the big country were so traumatized by the filming experience that they refused to speak about it for years. The political journey, from civil rights marcher to culture war warrior, from gun control advocate to NRA president who called trigger locks satanic, was not just a matter of personal opinion changing with age. It had real-world consequences in a country where gun violence kills tens of thousands of people every year. And the specific speech he gave in 1997, the one that got reprinted on a white supremacist's website and that the NAACP called bigoted, that happened. It is in the record. It cannot be explained away by Alzheimer's, because Heston gave that speech years before his diagnosis. It cannot be explained away by saying he was playing a character because he was speaking as himself at a political rally. It was Charlton Heston, unscripted, saying what he actually believed. Heston was more conservative than most actors and publicly clashed with outspoken liberal actors such as Ed Asner throughout his years as Screen Actors Guild president. The clashes were real and sometimes bitter. But being conservative is not the issue. Lots of people are conservative. The issue is the specific content of what Heston said, the homophobia, the framing of minority rights advocacy as an attack on real Americans, the language about cultural warfare that found a welcoming audience among people who believe in racial hierarchy. When Charlton Heston died on April 5, 2008, at the age of 84, the tributes were enormous. Presidents praised him. Colleagues remembered his talent and his charity And all of those things were legitimate. He was a man of genuine talent and genuine contradictions, which in many ways makes him more interesting than a simple villain would be. But the full story of Charlton Heston, the ego that made him hard to work alongside, the political evolution that took him from champion of civil rights to figurehead for positions that civil rights leaders called bigoted, the theatrical self-certainty that followed him from the Ten Commandments set all the way to an NRA convention stage, is a story worth telling in full. Not to tear down a legend for sport, but because the gap between the image and the reality of a powerful person is always where the most important truths live. He was Moses in the movie. On screen, Moses received the commandments. Off-screen, Charlton Heston seemed to believe he was beyond them. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, and join us for the next story.